Well then, boys and girls, I'm so glad you can looking forward to Christmas so soon. I can't believe how time's so quick. So I'm glad you can join me back to this new video. So it's Kid Bomber here. So we'll just take a break for reading the Christmas Carol. So I have done 2 chapters were by his ghost, and a first of the 3 spirits. It was the ghost of Christmas past, and so somehow now I'll be moving on to chapter 3 is second of the 3 spirits. It's known as Ghost of Christmas Present. Okay, so I hope you enjoy this video. Happy viewing, and let's begin reading to continue the Christmas Carol on part 3. Awaking in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore, and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was again upon the stroke of 1. He felt that he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time for a special purpose of holding a conference with a second messenger dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's intervention, but finding that he turned uncomfortably cold, where he began to wonder which of his contents this new spectre would draw back. He put them every one aside with his own hands, and laying down again, established a sharp lookout all around a bed, for he wished to challenge the spirit on the moment of his appearance, and did not wish to be taken by surprise and made nervous. Gentlemen of the free and easy sort, who plumb themselves on being acquainted with a move or two, and being usually equal to the time of day, express a wide range of their capacity of adventure by observing that they are good for everything from a pitch and toss to manslaughter, between which opposite extremes, no doubt, there lies a tolerably wide and comprehensive range of subjects, without venturing for Scrooge quite as hardly as this. I don't mind calling on you to believe that he was already for the good broad fields of strange appearances, and that nothing between the boy and rhinoceros would have astonished him very much. Now, being prepared for almost everything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing, and consequently, when a bell struck 1 and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fist of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour went by, yet as nothing came. All this time he laid upon his bed, a very core and the centre of a blaze of ruddy light, which streamed upon it when the clock proclaimed the hour, and which, being only light, was more alarming than a dozen ghosts, as he was powerless to make out what it meant, or would be at, and was sometimes apprehensive that he might be at every moment an interesting case of spontaneous combustion, without having a consolation of knowing it. At last, however, he began to think, as you or I would have thought of it at first, for it is always a person not in predicament who knows what ought to have been done it, and would unquestionably have done it too. At last, I say, he began to think that the source and secret of this ghostly light and might be in the adjoining room, from whence, on further tracing it, it seemed to shine. This idea taking full possession of his mind. He got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. For a moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock. A strange voice called him by his name and bade him enter. He obeyed. It was his own room. There was no doubt about that. But it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling was so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove, from every part of which bright gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light, as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there, and such a mighty blast went roaring up the chimney, as that your petrifaction of the hearth had never known in Scrooge's time or Marley's, or for many had a many winter season gone, heaped up on the floor to form a kind of throne where turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, barrels of oysters, red hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, emmis, 12 cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with a delicious steam. In easy state upon this couch, they sat a jolly giant glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and he held it up, high up, to shed its light on Scrooge, as he came peeping round the door. "Come in," exclaimed the ghost. "Come in." "And knew me better, man." Scrooge entered timidly, and hung his head before this spirit was not Dutch Scrooge, and had been, and though a spirit's eyes were clean and kind, he did not like to meet them. "I am a ghost for Christmas present," said the spirit. "Look upon me." Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple deep green robe, ornamental, bordered with a white fur. This garment hung so loosely on the figure that its capacious breast was bare, as if destined to be rewarded and concealed by any artifice. His feet are perceptible beneath the ample folds of the garment, were also bare. On his head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath. Set here, with a shining icicle, its dark brown curls were long and free as the general face, and sparkling eye, its open hand, its cherry voice, its unconstrained demeanour, and its joyful air, girded ground. Its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in, and ancient sheath was eaten up with rust. "You have never seen the likes of me before," exclaimed the spirit. "Never," Scrooge made the answer to it. I've never walked forth with the younger members of my family," meaning, I am very young. My eldest brother, born in 3 years later, pursued the phantom. "I don't think I have," said Scrooge. "I am afraid I have not. Have you had many brothers, spirit?" "More than 1800, said the ghost. "I a tremendous family to provide for, muttered Scrooge. The ghost of Scrooge's spirit rose. Spirit, said Scrooge submissively, conduct me. Where were you, Will? I went forth last night. Compulsion. I learnt a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it. Touch my robe. Scrooge did as he was told, and held it fast. Holly, mistletoe, woodberries, ivy, turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, meat, pigs, sausages, oyster pies, puddings, fruit and punch, all vanished instantly. So did the room, for fire that the rosy glow, the hour of night. And they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning. Where? For the weather was severe. The people were made rough, but brisk, and not unpleasant kind of music, in scraping the snow from a pavement in front of their dwellings, for the tops of their houses, whence it was mad delight to the boys to see it, come plumping down to the road below, and split it into artificial little snowstorm. The houses front looks black enough, and when the black window renders blacker, extracting with a smooth whitish sheet of snow upon the roofs, and with the dirtier snow upon the grounds, which last past had plunged up in deep furrows by the heavy wheels of carts and wagons, furrows that crossed and recrossed each other hundreds of times, where the great streets branched off and made intricated channels, hard to trace in thick yellow mud and icy water. The sky was gloomy, and the shortest streets were choked up with a dangy mist, half-filled, half-frozen, whose heavy articles descended in the showers of sootier tombs, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain had but one consent caught fire, and were blasting away to their dear hearts' contents. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate of the town, and yet it was there an air of cheerfulness abroad, that the cleverest summer air and brightest summer sun might have endeavoured to diffuse in vain. For the people who were shovering away on the housetops with jovial and full of glee, calling out to one another from the parapets, and now and then exchanging a fatuous snowball, betting a chilled missile above far than many a wordy jest, laughing heartily. It went right, and not less heartily, if it went wrong. The porter's shop was still half open, and the fruiterers were radiant in their glory. There were great round, pot-bellied baskets of chestnuts, shaped like waistcoats of jolly old good gentlemen, lollying at the doors and tumbling out into streets of their plenteous opulence. There were ruddy brown-faced, broad-gathered Spanish onions shining in the fatness of their growth like Spanish friars, and winking for their shells in wanton silence at the girls as they went by, and glanced demurely at the hung-up muscatel. There were pears and apples clustered high in blooming pyramids. There were a bunch of grapes and made in a shopkeeper's benevolence to dangle from conspicuous hooks that people's mouths might water gritties as they passed. There were piles of filberts and mossy and brown, recalling in their fragrance ancient walks among the woods and pleasant shuffling ankle deep through weathered leaves. There were Norfolk, Biffin, Scrub, and Swarthy, setting off the yellow of the oranges and lemons, and in the great compactness of their journey, juicy persons, actually untreated and beseeching to be carried home in paper bags and eaten after dinner. The very gold and silver fish set off among these choice fruits in the bowl, though members of the dull and stagnant and blooded race appeared to know that there was something going on, and to the fish went gasping round their little world in slow and passionless excitement. The grocers! Oh, the grocers! Nearly closed, with perhaps 2 shutters down, or 1, but through these gaps it was not alone, that the scales descending on the counter made a merry sound, or that a twin roller parted company so briskly, or the canisters were rattled up and down like a juggling tricks, or even that the blended scent of tea and coffee were so grateful to the nose, or even that the raisins were so plentiful and rare, or the almonds so extremely white, and the sticks of cinnamon are so long, and straight the other spice so delicious, the candied fruits so caked and spotted with the molten sugar as to make the coldest lockers on feel faint and subsequently release. Nor was it that the figs were moist and pulpy, or that the French plums blushed in a modest tartness from a highly decorated box, or that everything was good to eat and in its Christmas dress, but the customers were all so hurried and so eager in the hopeful promise of the day that they had tumbled up against each other at the door, clutching their weaker baskets widely, and left their purchases upon the counter and came running back to fetch them, and committed hundreds of the like mistakes in the best humour possible, while the grocer and his people were so frank and fresh that of the polished art with which they'd fastened their aprons behind not have been their own, worn outside for general inspection and for Christmas dolls to peck at if they choose. But soon the steeple called good people all to church and chapel, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes and their gayest faces, and at the same time they marched from scores of by streets, lanes, and nameless turnings, innumerable people, carrying their dinners to their bakers' shops. The sight of these poor revellers appeared to interest the spirit was very much, for he stood with Scrooge beside him in the baker's doorway, and taking off the covers as they bearers passed, sprinkled incense on their dinners from his torch, and it was a very uncommon kind of touch, for once or twice, when they were angry words between some dinner carriers who had jostled each other. He shed a few drops of water on them from it, and their good humour was restored directly. For they said it was a shame to quarrel upon a Christmas day, and so it was. God love it. So it was. In time, the bell ceased, and the bakers were shut up, and yet there was a general shadowing forth of all the dinners, and the progress of their cooking infelled blotch of wet above each baker's oven, while the paraffin smoked as if its stones were cooking too. Is there a peculiar flavour in what you sprinkle from your torch? Says Scrooge. There is my own. Would it apply to any kind of dinner on this day? Asks Scrooge. To any kind given to the poor one most. Why? To the poor one most? Asks Scrooge. Because it needs it most. Spirit, said Scrooge. Though after a moment's thought, I wonder you, all the beings in the many worlds about us, should decide to cramp these people's opportunity of their innocent enjoyment. I, cried the Spirit, would you deprive them of their means of dining every seventh day? Often the only day on which they can be said to dine at all, says Scrooge. Wouldn't you? I, cried the Spirit. You seek to close these places on the seventh day, says Scrooge, and it comes to the same thing. I seek, exclaimed the Spirit. Forgive me if I am wrong. It has been done in your name, or at least in that of your family, says Scrooge. There is some upon this earth of yours, returned the Spirit, who lay claim to know us, and who did their deeds of passion, pride and ill will, hatred and envy, and bigotry and selfishness in your name, who was as strange to us, and all the kith and kin, as they had never lived. Remember that, and they charge their doings on them, not us. Scrooge promised that he would, and they went one invincible as they had been before into suburbs of a town. It was remarkable quality of a ghost, which Scrooge had observed at the baker's, that notwithstanding this gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, and that he stood beneath a low roof quite as gracefully and like a supernatural creature as it was impossible he could have done in any lofty hall. And perhaps it was a pleasure the good Spirit, and in hadn't shown off his power of his, or else it was his own kind, generous, hearty nature, and his sympathy with all poor men, that led him straight to Scrooge's clerks. For there he went, and took Scrooge with him, holding to his robe, and on the threshold of the door a Spirit smiled, and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sparkling of his touch. Think for that, Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his fourth-roomed house. Then it uprose Mrs. Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for a sixpence, and she laid a cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged the fork into the saucepan of potatoes and getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar, Bob's Profit Company conferred upon his son an air of honour for day, into his mouth rejoiced to find himself so momentarily attard and yearned to show his linen in the fashionable parks, and now two small captives, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the bakers they had smelt the goose and known it for their own, and basking in the luxurious thoughts of sag and Sergeant Onion. These young Cratchits danced about the table and exhaust Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he not proud, although his collars nearly choked him, blew the fire until the snow potatoes bobbing up, knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let it out and peeled. "What has ever got your precious father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit. "And your brother, Tiny Tim? And Martha wasn't as late last Christmas Day by half an hour." "Here's Martha, mother," said the girl, appearing as she spoke. "Here's Martha, mother," cried the two young Cratchits. "Hooray, hooray! There's such a goose, Martha. Why, bless your heart alive, my dear." "How late you are," said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times, and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her, with a vicious seal. "We had a deal of work to finish off last night," replied the girl. "I had to clear away this morning, mother." "Well, never mind so long as you were come," said Mr. Cratchit. "Sit ye down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm. Lord bless ye." "Oh no, there's father coming," cried the two young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide." So Martha hid herself. "And come in, little Bob." The father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of a fringe, and hanging down before him, and threadbare clothes donned up and brushed to look seasonable, Tiny Tim upon his shoulder, Alice for Tiny Tim. He brought a little crutch, and his limbs supported by the iron frame. "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking round. "No, not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming," said Bob, with a sudden declension in his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from church, and had came home bumhead, not coming upon Christmas Day. Martha didn't like to see him disappointed if it were only in joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door, and ran into his arms, while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim, and bore him off into a wash house that might be here for pudding seen in a copper. "And how did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, when she had relied Bob on his credulity. and Bob Ham had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets a foot for sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you had ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people saw him in the church, because he was a crumple. It might be a pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day. Who made them beggars walked blind men see?" Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and came back Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, and escorted by his brother and sister to his stall before the fire, and while Bob turned his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, and compounded some hot mixture in the jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Crouches went to fetch a goose, with which they soon returned in the high pression. Such a bestial assured that you might have thought a goose a rarest of birds. The feathered phenomenon, to which a black swan was a matter of course, and in truth it was something very like it in that house. Mrs. Croucher made a gravy ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed with a potato with incredible vigour. Miss Belinda sweetened up the apple sauce. Martha dusted up the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table. The two young Crouches sat chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon the post, crammed spoons onto their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by the breathless pause, and as Mrs. Croucher looking slowly all along, the carving knife prepared to plunge it in the breast. But when she did, and when a long expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose around the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Crouchets, beat on the table with the handle of his knife, and feebly cried, "Hooray! There never was such a goose." Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavour, size and cheapness were the themes of universal eked out apart by the apple sauce and smashed potatoes. It was significant dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Croucher said, with great delight. Surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't ate all at last. Yet everyone had enough, and the youngest Crouches in particular were steeped in such an onion to her eyebrows. But now the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witnesses. To the pudding! Up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with a goose. A supposition at which the young Crouches became livid. All sorts of horror were supposed. Hallo, a great deal of steam. The pudding was out of a copper, a smell like a washing day. That was a cloth. A smell like a eating house, and the pastries cooks next door to each other, with a laundress next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding, like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in the half a quarter of ignited brandy and dead-eyed with a Christmas holly stuck into the top. "Oh, a wonderful pudding," Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he had regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind. She would confess she had had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat and hair's-high to do so. Any Cratchit would have been blushed to hint at such a place. At last, the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared. The hearth was swept, and the fire made up a compound in the jug, being tasted and considered perfect, and apples and oranges were put upon the table, and the shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then a Cratchit family drew round the hearth, in what Bob Cratchit called a circle of meaning half a one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood a family display of glass, two tumblers, and a custard cup without a handle. These held a hot stuff from a jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us, my dears. God bless us," which all family re-echoed. "God blesses everyone," said Tiny Tim, first of all. He sat very close to the father's side, upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirits," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before. "Tell me if Tiny Tim will live." I see vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "Oh no," said Scrooge. "Oh no, kind spirit, say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here." "What then? If he be like to die, he had better to do it and decrease surplus population. Scrooge handed his head to hear his own words, quoted by the ghost spirit, and he was overcome with penitence and grief. Man, said his ghost, if man you will be in heart, and not adamant, for there was that wicked until you have discovered what a surprise it is, and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than the minions like these poor men's child. Oh God. To hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust, Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eyebrows upon the ground, but raised them speedily on hearing his own name. Mr. Scrooge, said Bob. I'll give you, Mr. Scrooge, a fan of a feast. The fan of a feast, indeed, cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. I wish I had him here, and did give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he have a good appetite for it. My dear, said Bob, the children, Christmas Day. It should be Christmas Day, I am sure, said she, on which one drinks health of such an odious, stinging, hard, and unfriendly man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, poor fellow. My dear, was Bob's mild answer. Christmas Day, I drink this health for your sake and the days, said Mrs. Cratchit, not for his. Long life to him. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt. The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceeding, which had no heartens in it. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care 2 pence for it. Scrooge was an ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow of a party which was not dispelled. For 5 minutes after it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before. From a mere relief of Scrooge bound for being done with, Bob Cratchit told them how he had situation in his eye for Mr. Peter, which would bring him, if obtained, full 6 and 6 pence for 5 and 6 pence weekly. The 2 young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter's being a man of business, and Peter himself looks thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars, as if were deliberating what particular investments he should favour when he came unto the receipts of the fatby rental income. Arthur, who was a poor apprentice at the miller's, then told them what kind of work she had to do, and how many hours she worked at the stretch, and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest. Tomorrow being a holiday, she passed at home. Also, how she had seen Countess and the Lord some days before, and somehow the Lord was much about as tall as Peter, and at which Peter pulled up his collars so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. All this time the chestnuts and the jug went round and round. By and they had a song, but the lost child travelling in the snow from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice and sung it very indeed. There was nothing high marked in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty, and Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of the pawnbrokers, but they were happy and grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time, and when they faded, and looked happier yet in the bright sparklings of the Spirit's touch at parting. Scrooge had his own eye upon them, especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. But this time it was getting dark and snowing prettily heavily, and Scrooge and the Spirit went along with the streets. A brightness of not roaring fires in kitchens and parlours and all sorts of rooms was wonderful. Here, the flicking of a blast showed preparations for the cosy dinner with hot plates baking through and through before the fire, and deep red curtains ready to be drawn to shut out cold and darkness. Fair, all the children of the house were running out into the snow to meet their merry sisters and brothers and cousins, and were shadows on the window blind of guests as assembling, and they a group of handsome girls, all hooded and fur-booted, and all chattering at once, tripped lightly off to some near neighbour's house, where were upon a single man who saw them enter up for witches. Well, they knew it in no glow, but if you had judged from the numbers of people on their way to friendly gatherings, you might have thought that no one was at home to give them welcome. What they got instead of every house expecting company and piling up its fires half chimney high, blazing on it, how the ghost extolled, how it bared its breadth of breast, and opens its capacious palm, and floated on, outpouring with a generous hand its bright and harmless mirth of everything within its reach. The very lamplighter who ran on before dotting the dusky street with speak of light, who was dressed so to spend the evening somewhere, laughed loudly as the Spirit passed. For little Ken, the lamplighter, they had any company but Christmas, and now, without the word of warning from a ghost, they stood upon a bleak and desert moor, where monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about, as they thought it were a bare place of giants, and water spread itself whatsoever it listed, or would have done so, but for the frost they held it prisoner, and never grew but moss and fuzz, and coarse and rank grass. Down in the west the setting sun had left a streak of very red, which glared upon the desolation for an instant like a sullen eye, and falling lower yet, was not lost in the thick gloom of darkness night. What place is this? Said Scrooge. A place where miners live, who labour in the bowels of the earth, returned the Spirit. But they knew me, see? The light shone through the window of the hut, and swiftly they advanced towards it. Passing the wall of a murdered stone, they found a cheerful company assembled, round a glowing fire, and old man and woman, with their children and their children's children, and another generations, but beyond all checked out, girly in the holiday attire, the old man in the voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing them a Christmas song. It had time been a very old song when it was a boy from time to time. They all joined in the chorus. Surely, as they raised their voices, the old man got quiet and pliff and loud, and so surely, as they stopped, his figure sang again. The spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge hold his robe, pass it on above the moor. Sped river, not to see, to Scrooge's horror. Looking back, he saw a loss of a hand, frightful range of rocks behind them, and his ears were deafened by the thundering of water as it rolled and roared, and raged upon among the dreadful caverns it had worn, and ferociously tried to undermine the world. But upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks, some lake or some from shore, on which the waters chaffered and dashed, and the wild year through, there stood a sluttering lighthouse, great heaps of seaweed, clutched to its base, and stormed birds born of a wind. No one might suppose a seaweed of water, whereas it felt about it, like the ways they schemed. But even here, two men who watched the light had made a fire that through the loophole in the thick stone wall shed out a ray of brightness on the awful sea, joining their horny hands over the rough table at which they sat. They wished each other Merry Christmas in their can of grog, and one of them, the elder, too, with his face all damaged and scarred with hard weather, as they figurehead of an old ship might be, struck up a sturdy song that was like a girl in itself. Again, the ghost sped on. A perfect black and heavy rain on until been far away, as he told Scrooge. From any shore they lighted on a ship. They stood beside the hillsman at wheel, and they looked out in the by the officers who had the watch dark ghostly figures in their several stations. But every man among them hummed a Christmas tune or the Christmas thoughts, or spoke below his breath unto his compassion of some bygone Christmas day, with a homeward hopes belonging to it, and every man on board, walking or sleeping, good or bad, had a kinder word for another on that day than on any day in the year, and had shared to some extent in its festivities, had remembered those he cared for at a distance, had known that they delighted to remember him. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind, and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move on through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss, whose deeps were secrets as profound as death. It was a great surprise to Scrooge. While thus engaged to hear a hearty laugh, it was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognise it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with his spirit standing smiling by his side, and looking at the same nephew with approving affability. "Ha ha ha!" laughed Scrooge's nephew. "Ha ha ha! If you should happen, by any unlikely chance, to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, or, and can say is, I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and will all cultivate his acquaintance. It is a far even-handed, noble adjustment of things that while there is infection in disease, sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humour. When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his side, bowing his head, twisting his face into the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heavily as he, and they assembled friends, being not a bit behind hand, roared brustily, "Ha ha 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 ha!" said that Christmas was a humbug as I have, cried Scrooge's nephew. "I believed it too." "Well, shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece indignantly. "Bless those women, they never do anything by health. They are always in earnest." She was pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking, a capsule face, a little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was, all kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in a little creature's head. Altogether, she was what you would have called provoking, you know, but satisfactory too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. "He's a communal old fellow," said Scrooge's nephew. "That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offence carries their own punishment. I have nothing to say against him. I am sure he was very rich." "Fred," hinted Scrooge's niece, "at least you always tell me so." "What of that, my dear?" said Scrooge's nephew. "His wealth as of no use to him. He did not do anything good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't a satisfaction of thinking, ha ha ha, that he's ever going to benefit us with it." "I have no patience with him," observed Scrooge's niece's sisters, and all other ladies expressed the same opinion. "Oh, I have," said Scrooge's nephew. "I am sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I cried. Who suffered by his ill will himself, always here. He takes it onto his hands to dislike us, and he wouldn't came and dine with us. What's a coincidence? He do not lose much of a dinner." "Indeed, I think he loses every good dinner," interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had just had dinner, and with a dessert upon a table, and clustered round the fire, but by lamplight. "Well, I am very glad to hear it," said Scrooge's nephew, "because I haven't great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper?" Topper had clearly got his eye upon one of Scrooge's sisters, for he answered that the bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject. Whereas Scrooge's niece's sister, a plump one with a lace tucker, not the one with the roses. Thus, "Do go on, Fred," said Scrooge's niece, clapping their hands. "He never finishes what he begins to say. He is such a ridiculous fellow." Scrooge's nephew refilled in another laugh, and it was impossible to keep infection off. Though a plump sister tried hard to do it with a augmented vinegar, his example was unmodestly followed. "I was going to say," said Scrooge's nephew, "that the coincidence of his taking a dislike to us, and not making a merry with us, has, I think, that he'll lose some pleasant moments, which he could do him no harm. I am sure he'll lose his pleasanter compassion, that he can't find his own thoughts, either his mouldy old office or dusty chambers. I meant to give him the same chance for every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may wail at Christmas till he dies, but he couldn't help thinking better of it. I defy him. If he finds me going there in good temper, year after year, saying, 'Uncle Scrooge, how are you?' If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something. And I think I shocked him yesterday. It was a turn to laugh out, and the notion of shaking Scrooge. But being thoroughly good natured, and not much caring what they laughed at, so they can laugh at any rate. He encouraged them in their merriment, and they passed the bottle joyously. After tea, they had some music, for they were a musical family and know what they were about. When they sung a glee or catch, I can assure, especially Topper, who could grow away in the bass like the good one, and never swell a large veins in his forehead, or get red in the face all over it. Scrooge's niece played a well upon the harp, and played among other tunes some simple little air, a mere nothing. You might learn to whistle it in 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from a boarding school, as he had been reminded by the Ghost of Christmas Past. When this strain of music sounded, all the things that the ghost had showed him came upon his mind. He softened more and more, and he thought that if he could have listened to it often years ago, he might have cultivated a kindness of life for his own happiness with his own hands, without resorting to extant spade that buried Jacob Marley. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while, they played a 40 fets, for it is good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. Stop! There's the first again at the blind man's buff. Of course there was. And I no more believe Topper was really blind him then. I believe he had his eyes in his boots. My opinion is that it was a done thing between him and Scrooge's nephew, and the ghost of Scrooge's present knew it. Okay. The way he went after the blimp sister in the lace tucker was the outrage on the credulity of the human nature, knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping against the piano, smothering himself among the curtains. Wherever she went, there went he. He always knew where the plump sister was. He wouldn't catch any else. If you had fallen against him, as some of them did, and stood there, he would have made a vent of endeavouring to seize you, which have been an affront to your understanding, and would instantly have saddled off in the direction of the plump sister. She often cried out that wasn't fair, and it really was not. But when at last he caught her, when, in spite of all her shackened rustlings and her rapid flatterings past him, but he got her into the corner, whence there was no escape. Then his conduct was a most execrable, for his pretending not to know her, his pretending for it was necessary to touch her headdress, and further to ensure of her identity by pressing a certain ring upon her finger, and a certain chain about her neck was foul, monstrous, no doubt. She told him her opinion of it. When another blind man been in office, they were so very confidential together, but behind the curtains. Scrooge's niece was not one of the blind men's birth party, but was made comfortable with a large chair and footstool in a snug corner, where the ghost and Scrooge were close behind her. But she joined in the forfeits, and loved to admiration with all the letters of the alphabet. Likewise, at the game of how, when, and why, where, she was very great, and to the secret joy of Scrooge's nephew, beat her sisters hollow. Though they were sharp girls too, as Topper could have told you. There might have been 20 people there, young or old, but they all played, and so did Scrooge, for wholly forgetting in the interest he had in what was going on, that his voice made no sound in their ears. He sometimes came out with his guests quite loud, and very often guessed quite right, too, for sharpest needle, best Whitechapel warrant not to cut in the eye, was not sharper than Scrooge, blunt as he took it in his head to be. The ghost was gratefully pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him with such favour that he begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guest departed. But this spirit said, "Cannot be done." "Here's a new game," says Scrooge. 1/2 an hour, spirit only one. It was a game called yes or no. Where Scrooge's nephew had to think something, and rest must find what he answering to their questions on yes or no as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elected from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, whether a disgraceful animal, a disagreeable animal, a savage animal, and the animal growled and grunted sometimes and talked sometimes, lived in London and walked about the streets and wasn't made a show of and wasn't laid by anybody and didn't live in a menagerie and was never killed in the market and wasn't not a horse or an ass or a cow or a bull or a tiger or a dog or a pig or a cat or a bear, and every fresh question that was put to him. This nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter, and it was inexpressively Billy tickled that it was obliged to get up off a river and stamp at a last the plump sister, falling into a familiar similar state, cried out, "I have found it out! I have found it out! I knew it! It was Fred! I know what it was!" Was it? Cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge!" Which it was certainly. Admiration was a universal sentiment, though some objected that the reply to his "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes, inasmuch as an answer in a negative was significant to have diverted they thought from Mr. Scrooge, supposing they had ever had any tendency that way. "He has given us plenty of merriment, I am sure," said Fred, "and it would be ungrateful not to drink his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine ready to our hand. At the moment, I say, Uncle Scrooge." "Well, Uncle Scrooge," they cried, "a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to an old man, whatever he is," says Scrooge's nephew. "He wouldn't take it from me, but he have it nevertheless, Uncle Scrooge." Uncle Scrooge had perspectively, but became so gay and light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return, and thanked them in the inaudible speech, if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and a spirit were again upon their travels. Much they saw, and so they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirit stood by side six beds, and they were cheerful on foreign lands, and they were close at home, but struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope, but poverty, and it was rich, and almost hospital and jail, missionaries, every refuge were then men in his little brief authority had not made fast a door and barred the spirit out. He left his blessing and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but Scrooge had his doubts of this, because the Christmas because the Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into a space of time they passed together. It was a strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge observed this change, but never spoke of it until they left the children's 12th night party. When looking at the spirit as they stood together in the open place, he noted that his hair was grey. "Our spirits so live so short," said Scrooge, "but life is upon his globe. It's very brief," replied the ghost. "It ends tonight." "Tonight?" cried Scrooge. "Tonight? At midnight? Hark, the time is drawing near." The chimney were ringing, the chimes were ringing, for 3/4 past 11 and a moment. "Forgive me if I'm not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intensely at Scrooge's robes, "but I see something strange, not belonging to yourself, protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot or a claw? Or it might be a claw full of flesh. There's something upon," was the spirit's sorrowful reply. "Look here." From the foldings of his robe, it brought two children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at his feet and clung upon outside of his garment. "Oh, man, look here, look down here," exclaimed the ghost. They were a boy and a girl, yellow, grey, ragged, scolding, wolfish, but prostrate too in their humility. Were graceful youth. They have filled their feathers out, and touched them with its freshest tints. The stale and shriveled hand, like that of age, had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where the angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked and glared out menacing, and no change, and no degradation, no perversion of humanity in any grade. Further, all the mysteries of a wonderful creation has monsters have so horrible and dread. Scrooge started back, upheld, having them shown to him in his very this way. He tried to say they were fine children, but the words choked themselves. Whether then be parties to a lie of such numerous magnitude, spirit, are they yours? Scrooge could say no more. They are men's, said Scrooge, looking down upon them, and they are slain to me, appealing them from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware of them both, and all they degree. But most of all, beware of this boy. For on his brow I see that written which was doom. Unless the writing be erased, deny it, cried the spirit, stretching out his hand towards the city. Slender those who, tell it ye, admit to view your factious purpose, and make it worse, and bite the end. Have they no refuge or resource? Cried Scrooge. No, they are no prisons, said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. Are you there no workhouse? The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate. He remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn fountain, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground and towards him. Okay, so next chapter is the last of Christmas spirit. The last of the spirits is the ghost of Christmas yet to come. I hope you enjoyed that third part of Christmas Carol in chapter 3. So it's going to take a break now. I'll see you guys for a bit.